Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another New Year, New Language Summit session. And in this session, I'm proud to present Heidi Lovejoy back to the summit. And Heidi's been talking about a lot of these psychological, mental hurdles that we might be facing. And she's helped me a lot over the years. For instance, her presentation on perfectionism a couple of years ago actually made me realize how much I was struggling with perfectionism. So if you have the All Access Gold Pass, or an All Access Pass from that year, you can go back and watch that in the archives. Just click on Heidi's speaker profile, and her previous presentations will show up there. And this year, we're talking about a lot of the language lies that we tell ourselves and how to deal with them. So, language learning isn't always about how to learn grammar the best way or how to improve your pronunciation. A lot of the time, you're actually dealing with the challenge, the kind of mental obstacles, and the building the habits and building the consistency, which is indeed the theme of this year's event. And a lot of times, your own brain, your own mindset is actually going to be the biggest enemy of all. And so, if you can tame that inner voice and kind of deal with those problems, then you can be much more successful, not just in language learning, but actually in anything. I've found that the kind of interest in improving my language learning has spiraled into all other areas of life, and they are universal. So you can actually use what Heidi's talking about to, whether you want to get in shape or you want to learn chess or an instrument or whatever it may be. So definitely check out this presentation with Heidi and the previous ones, and I'll see you in a future session.
All right. Thank you, Chris, for having me back on this year. I'm glad that I didn't scare you away either. And thank you, everyone who's decided to be in here and listening. It's always really exciting to talk about language learning. So today, I'm going to start with a question. Even though this is pre recorded, I want to get a little bit interactive. Raise your hand if you consider yourself an honest person. So, how many of you think of yourself as honest? I definitely think of myself that way. Chris is raising his hand too. I'm not a deceitful person. I don't think I'm manipulative in any way. But let's be real. I do not always speak the truth to myself, especially when it comes to my language life. And it's really easy for me now, after almost 8 years of learning languages, to look back and see that many of these not complete truths I've told myself have held me back on my language journey. Not being honest with myself has prevented me from making good decisions about what to do next and has prevented me from learning efficiently. And this has added years to my language progress in some instances. So, if you read the description of my presentation, then you know where we're going today. I fully believe that the more honest we are with ourselves about our realities, our personalities, our preferences, our language levels, our language skills, everything, the more honest we are, the easier we can leverage those realities and our real situations in order to create the language life that we want. So today I want to explore some answers to these questions. How and why do we lie to ourselves? Why is honesty really the best policy for our language learning? How can honesty expedite reaching our language goals? And how can we be more truthful, especially to ourselves? So let's start with what I mean when I talk about honesty. I think a lot of people think of honesty as black and white, truth versus lies. But I'd like to present honesty today as a bit of a spectrum. On one end are the total falsehoods, like if I told you that my name was Sarah, it isn't. So that's a complete lie. On the other end are those full and complete truths, like my name is Heidi Lovejoy, completely true. And somewhere in the middle are partial truths, lies by omission, and even avoidance of the truth. And in this gray area, sometimes we make true statements, but maybe they imply something that's untrue. Like there's a lot left unsaid, right? We leave out those details that would clarify the whole story and the whole truth. Sometimes it's intentional because we just want to lead other people to think things that aren't necessarily true, but we haven't said the untrue thing. So there might be some intention of deceit. And sometimes it's just partial truths to keep a conversation flowing, depending on the audience or the situation. We don't always have to tell all the truths about ourselves, but we might still know that there are untrue implications about what we say. And We might just need to keep things simple. So there's no real intention to deceive. Then there's also that avoidance of the truth, which is when we don't really maybe make any statements. We may not think or say any words, so there aren't any lies, but we avoid the truth. We don't allow ourselves to think about the truth, and we fail to accept our reality as it is. So, as I talk about honesty today and why it's important in our language learning, I'm talking about this entire spectrum, not just those bald faced lies. There's a whole lot more nuance, I think, to truth telling and why it's important for our languages. So, let's talk next about what leads us to being dishonest. And for language learning, let's consider just being dishonest with ourselves, because that's really where it starts, is our internal monologue. There's a lot of reasons why we as human beings aren't fully honest with ourselves in various situations. I think that at the heart of every lie or not complete truth we tell is a desire to protect ourselves from something. Lies protect our egos from the pain of reality. They protect our self esteem because we don't like feeling inadequate or like we're failing at something. We also lie to avoid rejection or embarrassment or to try and shove down feelings of not belonging in certain spaces. And I found all of this to be especially true in language learning. I think learning language very naturally puts us in a perpetually vulnerable place. There are so many perceptions about learning a language, like it's hard, it's only for smart people, only the most dedicated people can learn a language. So many perceptions that we have that we internalize them and we use them as a basis of judgment against how we're progressing. We may spend hours and hours every week, every month going into our language learning. It grows into years of learning a language, so much time we dedicate to it. And if we aren't where we think we should be, or we fail to exhibit our true skills, like we forget words or we freeze up, we feel embarrassed. We feel ashamed of not having done more or spent more time studying, and we feel really vulnerable. So telling our whole, unaltered truth can actually feel painful because there are negative feelings associated with our realities if we aren't where we want to be or aren't able to do things that we think we should be able to do in our languages. And these negative feelings make it really easy to want to go into escape or protection mode. And sometimes that protection shows up as untruths or not complete truths. Lying and omitting important information, or even simply ignoring the truth, is a way that humans protect ourselves from these feelings of vulnerability. It's an escape from reality. So definitely hear me when I say that I'm not judging anyone or slapping some type of you're a liar label on any of us. This is really just human behavior, but it does our language learning journeys absolutely no good. So let's keep unpacking that. What are some examples of not being honest with ourselves in our language lives? Here are just a few untruths that I've jotted down. And to put myself on blast, these are all things I've told myself at one point or another in my language journey, knowing deep down when I said them that they aren't completely true. And that's really where the damage lies. So, first, I study my language all the time, followed by wondering why I'm not progressing much. When the reality is that I think about learning my language all the time, I think about studying all the time, but my actual study may be 10 minutes of an app every few days. When looking for new resources, I've told myself that this time I really am going to do this book or program every single day until it's complete. I know I'm going to do it. But I also know myself well enough to know that this isn't going to happen. I know it's not reality for me. That's not how I function. But it does make me feel like I'm doing something for my languages if I get a new resource, even if I don't need one. I've told myself that my language goal is just to understand and be understood. That's all I want is communication. Knowing darn well that I actually wanted, quote, perfect fluency, but I knew that that's not the right thing to say or the feel good thing to say. It's more acceptable to say that you just want to learn to communicate, right? But at that point in my language journey, that wasn't truth for me. I really did want more than just being able to communicate. So, this brings me to the more general dishonesty that can come up without distinct statements or words. So, that truth avoidance. This lack of honesty has also hurt my language learning. I'm talking about things like mentally reviewing a conversation lesson I had by only focusing on the things that I did right. So, avoiding the fact that there were mistakes because those cause feelings of embarrassment. Acting like I'm not a perfectionist and trying to show up as a non perfectionist in my language life. I've convinced myself that I'm the kind of person who loves flashcards in times when I hate using flashcards, like the very beginning of a new language. I've completely ignored my mentally disorganized nature by trying over and over to stick to a strict learning schedule, not staying with it, and then never going back to address the truth of the mental disorganization. I'm sure by now, some of you are probably saying, well, crap, I'm really not all that truthful. And many of you may be thinking these are just things we tell ourselves that could maybe be considered little white lies, or maybe it's a fake it till you make it sort of thing, but they aren't really harming anything. So, what's the big deal? Let's get into that. Why is complete honesty really the best policy for our language learning? And my short answer is as simple as this: when we are fully honest with ourselves about our realities as they are, we give ourselves the ability to choose the best path for creating the reality that we want. When we're fully honest with ourselves about our realities, we can now choose to take action to create the realities that we really, really want. If we want to change something in our language lives, we want to make more progress, speak better, understand better, we can't make that change well without being honest with ourselves about where we currently are. We make objectively better choices, I think, for our languages when we're fully honest about our language realities. I would even argue that these untruths, especially the ones that stem from protecting ourselves from vulnerable feelings, these are just us being in denial. When I tell myself that I study all the time, but really I think about studying all the time, and actually, when I get on my phone to do an app, I find myself toggling over to Instagram more often, that's me being in denial. I'm denying the reality that I haven't had the self control and discipline to stay in a language learning space and off of social media. The consequence of that denial is that I continue this behavior and continue spending less time and less quality time with my languages than it would be effective for progress. And often, I think the more we tell ourselves these little white lies, or the more we avoid the truth, the more we start to believe the untruths. And that doesn't help us make the best decisions for our languages. So here's an example that happened to me in real life with Italian. And I'll preface it by saying, please don't judge because it's really embarrassing, but we're going with it anyway. Based on absolutely nothing other than probably my ego, I had convinced myself after maybe 2 years or so of living in Italy that my Italian was quite highly functional. And that was definitely a truth avoidance situation because it was not at all functional. But I didn't even consider the truth of my real abilities. Like it didn't even come into my mind. I was completely avoiding the truth of not really being able to communicate well. I wouldn't allow myself to see that truth at all. So I ended up going to a parent teacher conference alone with no friends or interpreters to help me. The consequence of this truth avoidance about my real Italian abilities was that I didn't understand important information that the teachers gave me. I couldn't respond well. I couldn't ask the right questions or be an advocate for my child in her education. I was not capable of communicating in the way I needed for the situation. Stepping into that meeting, my confidence was not based on reality. It was based on what I wanted reality to be and had convinced myself that it was based on absolutely nothing. To protect myself from my own embarrassment and guilt and shame for not having done more of the work to have a better command of the language. And saying this out loud sounds a little bit negligent and maybe even stupid, if I'm being honest. But at that time in my life, admitting that I'd been living in Italy for nearly 2 years, learning the language, but not being anywhere near fluent was embarrassing. But by never facing that truth, I had convinced myself that it was much further along than it was, and there were consequences to me believing this, despite knowing deep down that it really wasn't true. Even though I'd never spoken these words out, out loud or even formed a sentence in my head, I had still convinced myself of this, and there were consequences. There were also consequences for my actual Italian learning journey after having that meeting. I felt so much shame, really, really embarrassed, so much shame for not having put in more work with the language. I felt guilt for feeling like I had failed my daughter, and immense embarrassment for where my language abilities really were. And I ended up going very deeper into protection avoidance mode. And I couldn't even face the language after that. When this reality was staring me in the face in this meeting where I failed communication, I couldn't bring myself to accept that reality because it didn't match the untruth that I'd been pretending to live. So my mind just sort of glitched out, and I couldn't bring myself to study Italian in any meaningful way for months after that. Because facing the beginner and lower intermediate language materials that were appropriate for my level felt really shameful. It was a constant reminder of this negative experience, and it was forcing me to see a truth that I wasn't yet willing to see. And this added a really lot amount of time and frustration to my Italian learning journey. Of course, most of the not so true things we tell ourselves probably don't have such dramatic consequences on our language progress. But they do hold us back in the long run because the more time we spend trying to live the language life we wish were true, and the more we make language study decisions based on what we want to be true, the less time we have to live the language life that we actually have, that's right in front of us. So let's look closer at some examples of how not being honest can really set back our language progress. Here's just a few untruths and consequences that, again, come up just from my life. One untruth: pretending as if I'm not a perfectionist, just completely ignoring this very real part of my personality. One of many consequences to this that is that I avoided anything that made me feel vulnerable, like speaking Italian. By ignoring my perfectionist side and sort of pretending it didn't exist, I failed to figure out for a really long time how a perfectionist might deal with making mistakes, for example. I would completely freeze every time I made a speaking mistake. And instead of working to change this and improve my mistake reactions, for the longest time, I just avoided speaking because that was too painful. An untruth: telling myself I love doing flashcards in the beginning of a new language because I don't know, they've been effective in the past when I was forced to do them in school or something. The consequence to this is that I have spent an insane amount of time making and building flashcard decks in Anki for beginner vocabulary that I never even use. And then this wasn't an efficient method because I wasn't retaining any of the vocabulary because I wasn't doing the flashcards, even though I'd spent so much time doing them. Another untruth: acting as if I'm a mentally organized person and I can stick to a strict learning schedule. And the truth is, that's not at all true. I'm a very spontaneous learner. The consequence of this is time spent writing down all the language activities I'm going to do, then not doing most of them because in the moment of studying, I don't want to do what I've written. So I'm easily distracted by anything else. Then I feel like a failure or like I'm lazy or not having stuck to the schedule. And sometimes then abandoning any study time for several days to avoid those negative feelings of laziness or like I've let myself down. Another untruth: I spend so much time learning my language, when in reality, maybe I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about it or having resources up on my phone, but I'm not really focusing on them or engaging with them. So the consequence, at best, I keep the status quo and make very slow, if any, progress. At worst, I get frustrated for not progressing faster. And instead of finding a solution, I feel like giving up altogether. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, but I think it really starts to show how a lack of complete honesty with ourselves does or can negatively affect our language learning. Now let's address the opposite of these. How can facing the truth positively affect our language learning? And I'll use the same examples here, just the opposite of them. So, truth: I am very much a certified perfectionist, and making mistakes really bothers me. Consequence of this truth and living this truth is that I show up as a perfectionist. I work very intentionally on giving myself grace, deliberately practicing moving conversations forward after a mistake, and reviewing and practicing those mistakes in order to get better. Truth. I hate flashcards in the beginning of a language, but I do really well with them in short bursts of intensive language projects. So the consequence is that I find other ways to retain beginner vocabulary. It's much more efficient and much more enjoyable. And I pull out those flashcards for a limited time only when I have the motivation and feel like actually doing them. A truth. I am a very spontaneous learner who chooses my activities in the moment based on what I feel like doing in the moment. Consequence of accepting that truth is that I have a variety of resources and methods at my disposal, and I willingly and excitedly choose what I'm in the mood for. Then I can be fully engaged in each study session or learning experience because it's what I really want to do in that moment, not what I tried forcing myself to do with some strict schedule. Another truth. Sometimes I am not really studying, even when a resource is right in front of me. This is especially true in the evenings when I'm tired and I may have my favorite language app up, but I keep finding myself going over to social media instead. The consequence of knowing and accepting this truth is that I try not to open language apps or resources when I'm tired because I really don't want to skew my perception of how much time I've actually spent with a language. Then I feel more in line with the progress I'm making. And I have a much more accurate starting point for changing things up if I need, whenever I do have my focus language time. So, in each of these examples, being dishonest or avoiding the truth really leads to me wasting a lot of time doing things that are ineffective for me, or often quickly leads to burnout, feelings of failure and frustration, or even avoiding languages completely for some amount of time in order to escape those negative feelings. But being completely honest with who I am and how I show up in my own language life allows me to make the best choices for me and my language preferences. And it gives me space to find solutions to problems instead of just avoiding those problems. I learn how to function as I am instead of trying to force myself into something I'm not, because like, yeah, I can really only fake it for so long before it's out the window. The more time we spend being in a headspace of untruths, even if it's simply not accepting ourselves as we really are and trying to fight against that, the longer we're in this place of not being completely honest, the bumpier our language journey is going to be. For me, I literally spent years trying to live a language life that wasn't mine. I wanted to fit into this mold of what I thought a language learner was supposed to be. And in doing so, I denied my actual reality and my real truths. And I failed over and over to choose language time and language activities and responses or reactions to situations that were in my best interest and would actually move my languages forward. But when I started being truthful with myself about who I was and what I liked, what I wasn't so good at, that was a moment of really huge liberation for me, I think, in my language journey. Brutal honesty and even radical acceptance of our situations gives us the freedom to shape our language lives the way we want and in a way that's enjoyable, and we're able to make good language choices. Now, I'll start kind of bringing this all together by talking about how we can be more honest with ourselves. So, to get even more personal, I've been sober for 5 years now, and I like to think of the process of being honest with myself in my language life, and elsewhere, in terms of the process to sobriety or recovery from addiction. So, when we tell ourselves untruths, like I said, we're really in denial, right? We're in denial about our realities and we're trying to protect ourselves from those negative feelings associated with our realities. And the choices we make are an attempt to escape those realities. So, the first step to recovery from dishonesty, I'll say, is to admit that we have a problem. Just admit to ourselves when we aren't being honest. We don't have to do anything with that information yet. In this step, we just admit that there are times when we aren't telling the whole truth or we aren't acting in a way that's consistent with our true selves. The next step is to acknowledge those very specific times in action. Recognize when you're telling an untruth or a partial truth or when you're avoiding the truth. For example, telling myself, I study German all the time. Why is it taking so long? But then taking a moment to acknowledge, Okay, so maybe not all the time. That's not completely true. I actually haven't studied German in like 5 days. So I've acknowledged that at least it's not a truth. And most importantly, I'm not judging myself here. I'm not calling myself a liar. I'm not making any sort of labels or anything, just observing what's going on and what my real thoughts are. Once we've acknowledged that this happens, we've admitted that we haven't been honest with ourselves, we recognize specific times when we aren't being truthful. The next step we want to do is consider what was happening in the moments just before the untruth. This is our data collection phase, and it starts giving us some insights into what truths or feelings we may be trying to avoid. So, the same example, I study German all the time. Why is it taking so long? I notice that I'm thinking this, and I say, okay, I don't study all the time. So, without judgment, I recognize this as an untruth. And now I take a moment to think about what triggered these words in the first place. And for me, this is always an event and a feeling together. Maybe I had a really bad conversation lesson where I couldn't seem to piece together a sentence to save my life. That's the event, and I felt embarrassed. Or living in Germany, someone asks me a question or spontaneously tries talking to me, which of course does not happen often in Germany, but let's say I blank, I don't understand anything. That's an event, and I feel shame. I feel like I don't belong here. Maybe I'm watching German TV or listening to a podcast, but I can't really follow along. That's an event, and it's joined by feelings of frustration and failure. Last night, I was reading a book by an Italian author, Gianluca Gotto, called Profondo come il mare, leggero come il cielo. And he says, I'll say it in Italian first and then translate. Quando la nostra mente non è calma e sotto controllo, ci trascina lontano dalla verità. When our mind isn't calm and under control, it drags us far from the truth. And these events that I mentioned cause agitation in my mind. The negative feelings leave my thoughts out of control. And this drags me really far from the truth, where that little white lie of, but I study all the time, pops up. So, with this step in our recovery from dishonesty, we're learning our triggers, those events and feelings that we're trying to protect ourselves from and that drag us away from the truth. Once we know the events that put us in this vulnerable space where negative feelings come up and lead to being dishonest with ourselves, then we can start doing the work to tackle the problem at the source. And by that, I do not mean avoiding all the triggers that make us feel bad. That would be way too easy. We're going to allow ourselves to have the feelings without trying to shield ourselves from them. This is really hard work, even in language learning. Are you feeling embarrassed for not having studied and having a really crappy conversation? Just feel that embarrassment with no judgment and let it pass, and it will. Are you feeling shame for not having been fluent in the local language? Feel that shame and then let it pass. Maybe you're frustrated that you don't understand a TV show, angry that you've asked someone to repeat themselves two or three times, but you still don't understand, disappointed that you aren't doing well on practice tests for a CEFR exam, facing guilt for spending half an hour on social media when you first woke up instead of getting out of bed and hitting the books. Let those feelings be. Just let them exist because the truth is that they will pass, and if we don't try to cover them up, if we don't try to cover those uncomfortable feelings, they actually go away faster. And then we become better at dealing with them in the future because they don't have the chance to just keep piling up. When they have passed, and again, they will, now is the time to plan and take new action. Back to our example. I am so embarrassed that I didn't study German all week, and I had such a horrible conversation lesson with my teacher. And this is a real life example for me here. I've had this experience so many times. So I feel embarrassed. Then I just sit with it. I don't judge myself and my lack of studying. I don't try to shove down my embarrassment. And eventually those feelings pass. Now, with a calm and under control mind, I can say, okay, that feeling sucks. I hate feeling embarrassed. I felt embarrassed because of my crappy conversation skills this morning, but why were they crappy? Because I haven't been practicing. So let's get to work. Like I said before, when we are fully honest with ourselves and our realities, we give ourselves the ability to choose the best path for creating the reality we want. So now that I've been honest with myself in this example, I'm able to look at the reality of my study time and choose to change it in order to create the German language life that I really, really want. So, having given the negative feelings space to exist and letting them pass, I'm now strong enough to actually face the truth about my language study time and how my conversation lessons are going, and then improve the quality of my language time. I actually work the program or the book I've committed to. I journal or do writing prompts. I talk to myself in German when I'm out for a walk. I do all the activities because I'm no longer stuck in those feelings of embarrassment and shame. So I really buckle down and do that work. And now, the next time I have a bad conversation lesson, I'm actually less likely to feel embarrassed because one, I did do the work, so there's nothing to be embarrassed about. And two, I know how to respond to the event that in the past would have triggered me. So, this is the process that I like to consider when it comes to learning how to be completely and wholeheartedly honest with ourselves in our language lives. Admit that we aren't actually completely honest all the time. Recognize when we aren't. Consider what was happening right before the untruth and how we were feeling. Let those feelings be. Just sit with them until they pass. And then use your newly cleared head to make the best language decisions for yourself. One last thing that's a huge key to successful honesty that I've kind of talked around a little bit here is acceptance. And I'd even say just radical acceptance of who you are and how you function, what your entire life situation is, because this really is the truth that sets us free. It's one thing to admit that I'm a perfectionist, for example, and recognize when I'm actually acting in a perfectionist way and consider what situations and triggers that triggers a perfectionist response. But without radically accepting that this is who I am and that it's why I approach my language life the way I do, then I'm likely to kind of stay stagnant in this area. Without accepting it, I'm not in a position to work with it and discover good perfectionist choices, for example. So, the benefits of using the information we gather about our situations and feelings are magnified when we accept ourselves and our situations for who we are and for what they are. Accept the phase of life that we're in. Accept the energy that we have at the end of the day or other challenges we're facing in life that are out of our control, but that affect how we show up as language learners. Because it actually takes a whole lot of real mental work to deny ourselves those warm, fuzzy untruths or incomplete truths. They feel really good in the moment, but we have to work to overcome those to be able to make better choices. And it can take a whole lot of real emotional work to admit that our realities are not what we want them to be. And then it takes strength to make the important changes it takes to get where we want to be. And there are incredible benefits of working toward being more honest with ourselves about our language journeys and our language realities. I can definitely say that this type of complete honesty has largely turned my entire language life into something much more manageable, much more enjoyable, and definitely more effective for making real, lasting progress. So, I might have been a little bit fast there. Sorry if I speak really quickly, but that's the end of my part of the presentation today. Chris, if you want to come back and let's chat.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Heidi. Lots to think about there. And I was thinking about like the big lies, and I think for me the main ones are when we play the comparison game. First of
Mm,
all, like we'll see successful language learners online, and we kind of adapt their personalities or parts of their personalities that we think we can, or that we will be the same as them. And
mm-hmm.
then most people obviously fail horribly because you are you. You're the only one who can be you, so be you, not them. And the other one is the big one about actually learning the language when you might be telling yourself, "Oh, I'm learning German," but then when you look at the calendar or the actions, they don't really say that. They say more, "Oh, you're learning about German," or "You're spending time researching how to learn German," or
Mm,
you're doing all this stuff, but it's not actually the actions that you learn a language with, like the actual lessons and grammar books and tutoring and things like that. So those are kind of the big ones that I see, because comparison with social media is so big that we get into this phase and then we get disappointed because we don't get the results
Yeah.
typically that the people we've kind of been inspired by, let's say. So those are the big ones. But I would ask you, is there a big difference between the conscious and unconscious elements of this? Because obviously, if you're just starting out and you get inspired by someone, or you, for some reason, you spend a lot of time not learning the language, but you think you are. Obviously, that's not a like a conscious action to
Right.
delude yourself. It's maybe more ignorance that you don't know what you're doing. Do you see a difference there? And in some of your examples, is there a difference, or is it really just it doesn't really matter if we do it subconsciously or not? It's still lying to ourselves.
It might still be lying to ourselves, but you're right. I mean, we don't know what we don't know. So, someone who's just starting out and doesn't quite know what they're doing and is trying to figure out resources or what works. Yeah, I don't think anyone's necessarily being dishonest or even avoiding the truth at that point.
Okay.
But there, in my experience, for my journeys, there definitely comes a point when I know that what I'm doing isn't working,
Hmm.
and not only do I push forward, I try telling myself that it's working, even
Right.
when it's not. Like there's just this kind of intuition, gut feeling, almost. And if we don't listen to that little voice and believe it, then we start continuing on this journey, and then we go to social media and say, well, look at this strict learning schedule that I've created for myself because I'm
Yeah.
telling myself it's true, but really the reality is I haven't looked at it in 3 days, and I look at it and I just feel disgust because I can't manage to do what I said I was going to do. Like, that's a lot more destructive to our overall journey than just trying to figure it out and not knowing. I think there is a distinct difference. Like, I wouldn't want anyone to leave this and be like, "Oh my gosh, how much do I lie to myself? Everything isn't working." It's not like that. But when we are doing those things, especially in the beginning, you don't necessarily know what you're doing, or there's resources you haven't tried or you haven't learned. Taking the time to assess how you feel about those. Am I really doing this app most days? How do I feel when I'm coming to this app? That data is going to give us information to know if the truth about, is this resource good for us at this phase or at this level that I'm at. And I think being able to assess that is a huge benefit for being able to be completely honest with ourselves.
Right. And of course, all this, just like your previous presentations at Do Your New Language, are all applicable to all areas of life, really. I was thinking how we do, especially with, let's say health or other career questions, how delusional we can be, but really being very self-aware and looking inwards and saying, you know what, I don't feel like this is me, and I definitely have tried that many times, and especially with the language learning. But there are other examples. For instance, I don't use social media at all because I just think it's a net negative for me personally, certainly, but even arguably for society. So if I was on Twitter or any other platform, doing the things that people that enjoy those platforms and like those platforms do, I would feel like
Mm.
out of place. I would be feeling like a fake to myself,
Oh
and so
yeah.
that's what I see about it. But also with the language learning, I think it's obvious that a lot of people try to embrace personality traits from people they've seen on YouTube or you know maybe even presenters at the summit, because a lot of the summit sessions are very practical. So you might think, oh, I'll just do that. And that might work to some degree, and that might work sometimes. But you really have to be careful not to be carried away with that, because
Hmm.
it can lead to much bigger failures than if not. And you were kind of alluding to that. The biggest one I remember for myself was finding Benny Lewis and seeing his amazing 3-month project videos and being like, oh wow, he's having conversations in like 3 months, and I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna travel the world and learn a new language in 3 months. And I, of course, learned nothing in the first 3 months because I'm not Benny, and that's that's just a fact, and I need to be honest about that, and in a sense, double down on who you are. And again, that's got nothing to do with language learning. That's just in general. I think
Yeah.
people should be more comfortable.
Yeah.
But what are some ways that people can do that if they're kind of, because I know it's also scary to double down on yourself, because there's that old you shouldn't think you're better than others, so what kind of advice do you have for people to kind of let go and believe more in themselves, double down, and and
Ooh.
and just live your own life?
Well, do just that, live your own life. I, my first tongue-in-cheek response is to be turned 40. I turned 40 this year, and I'm like, I don't care what anyone else thinks or says. I'm going to do me, and that's what matters. There's some wisdom in age that I'm starting to find that I
Mm,
love. Honestly, for me, there even when you talk about like you seeing Benny Lewis and success that he's had and the things that he's done and you being inspired by it and then also trying to take it on for yourself, but it doesn't work. I felt the same when I was first started trying getting into I don't want to say content creation because I don't really create content other than podcasts, but like getting into speaking and being part of the language community in this way. I was thinking, okay, tips and tricks. Well, at that point, I'd only been learning languages for a couple of years. I'm like, I'm not the kind of person who has tips and tricks, but I still felt like that's what I needed to do because of
hmm.
that perception. And when I started putting out some things that were really well written, really well said, there still was just something being like, yeah, but this isn't it. I didn't feel very authentic. And then eventually you run out of content because it's not your content really. Um, so just being able where I really wanted to go with it, I guess, was that when I finally started talking about me specifically and my struggles and things that other people don't necessarily say out loud, or I'll say to my friend, but I'm not putting on social media.
Hmm.
That was for me huge liberation. I've gotten so much validation even from listeners being like, hey, I thought I was the only one who had these particular struggles because people aren't talking about it. And that really helps me be even more honest because I know that I'm not alone. So even if we're not talking about it, we're not creating podcasts, we're not going out and talking about sharing our whole life details with people in the way that I do sometimes, being able to have someone, anyone, a journal even to write your reality. Like I feel like I'm alone because I'm a perfectionist and everyone out there says, "Oh, just realize no one else is perfect." But that's not me. I can't do that. Like writing
Hmm.
down that reality of my brain doesn't work that way is the first step to really being able to accept that and then find other people who are talking about it because even if you don't want to talk about your lack of honesty, I'm here talking about it. So there is someone else
Hmm.
out there. There are other people out there creating things and putting out blog articles or podcasts or whatever talking about those things. So
Right.
trying to
So
find the other people talking about it is excellent.
so reflecting yourself is also helpful through journals, or even just having a little session thinking about, how do I feel about this?
Hmm.
Sometimes we don't stop and think. We just
Oh
kind of
yeah.
get carried away.
Oh yeah. Whenever, so I actually listened to a language learning podcast sometime in the last year, and I can't remember which one it was. But someone in there, a very highly respected language person, probably someone who's speaking at this conference, said something along the lines of, if it's taking you more than 2 years to reach B2, there's something wrong. And
Hmm.
this was an interview between two people who've learned languages very efficiently, fluently. They've been doing it for decades, right? I was not the target audience for that, but I was listening because anyone can listen.
Sure.
Um, and hearing that, actually, my first reaction was, well, that's not cool because I've been learning Italian for 6 years and I'm not a B2 yet. And I kind of just sat with that feeling of, I lived in Italy for 4 years. Granted, one was COVID. So I lived in Italy for 3 years, we'll say. Learning the language still wasn't B2. Feelings of failure, feelings of what could I have done different, and all those negative feelings. And then just kind of being like, yeah, but that's my story. It's my story. It is what it is. I can't go back and change it. So I don't care what this very well respected, educated, experienced person says. My story is it can take a lot longer, and there's legitimate reasons that it can. And from there, my next season of my podcast is going to be 9 interviews with people who are learning languages to B1 in over 5 years. Like, let's bring out those real
Hmm.
stories of reality. But I was able to have my feelings of embarrassment and shame and guilt and all that stuff, and then be like, meh, Okay, it just is. There's nothing I can do to change that. But what can I do now? I can use those negative feelings to motivate myself to keep going. And I did. And I passed my B2 exam this year after
Congratulations.
7 years of learning the language.
Well, I mean, I don't see any time limits on language learning.
Not at
I
all.
think you take your time. That's the
Yeah.
because if you're not enjoying it either, then I mean that's kind of a brutal reality, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's another really good point of honesty too. We get burned out. We don't like the language. We see grammar things that we're like, oh, I'm not even going to touch that for at least another year because I don't want to know that this exists with the subjunctive. For example, if we're at least honest and be like, you know what, I understand that I am feeling burned out. I am not feeling motivated right now.
Hmm.
If we try to continue pushing forward, it's going to take us so much longer when we decide to crash. If I'm feeling burned out and I respect the feelings of burnout and I put the language aside for a few days, I will avoid putting it aside for 3 months almost
Yeah,
every single time.
yeah, for sure. There's so many negative ramifications of this process, but I think some of them are even the kind of not obvious that it's happening. Like for instance, the person who thinks they're learning a language, but they don't really set into motion habits and routines that actually push the needle. They spend so much time doing everything else basically, and then it comes crashing down, and that could be years later. They're like,
Yeah, yeah.
"Oh my God, I don't know anything." Like
Yeah.
that was kind of my German experience. I had German in school for years and years and years. But of course, it's only about, two classes a week. There's a class full of kids, so you don't really get that much. I think I taught it up to about something like 300 hours of German from my entire school time. And then I took a placement test in uni, this UNDAF, and I was like, I've never seen this before. Like the conjugated pronouns, relative pronouns. It's like dessen. What? I've never seen this before. And so it's like I really got a reality check. I think I think I got like a B1 or something, but and that was just in a theoretical kind of grammatical
Hmm.
sense, not speaking or anything. That was just a grammar test. And I was just like, wow, I've been doing this forever. And it just, but when you do the math of, well, it's not that many hours, and it's been over a
Hmm.
very long time. You only have about a class or two a week, and you've got 20 students in the class. Maybe you skip some classes, maybe you were sick, whatever. And then you get to the reality that it's actually not that much time. If you
Yeah.
look at the guidelines for learning a language to even that kind of intermediate stage, they're saying, hundreds and hundreds of hours and that's intense study.
Yep.
It's not, you can't get fluent in German by watching 600 hours of, what's that, Kommissar Rex or something, That's a very obscure reference for, for
Well, and there's
but the
also
Germans
there's
out there are
also
like, yes, Kommissar Rex.
there's
So,
also the
yeah,
quality of your study. If I say
exactly.
I studied for an hour today, 5 days a week, that's 5 hours. There's half an hour of conversation where the teacher did most of the speaking is not equal to half an hour of conversation where I do most of the speaking.
No,
Half an
not at
hour
all.
of reading about this grammar thing is learning, but it's not the same quality as doing the intensive exercises where I'm practicing and
Yeah.
making mistakes and then writing my own. And all of that's okay. Like all that variety is good. But if we're being honest about the quality of our time, and that goes back to me doing language apps on my phone. But I, I'm so tired in the evenings. My brain, I might get up at 4:30 in the morning. By 4:30 in the evening, I'm like, I'm checked out.
Yeah.
But I'm on an app and I'm doing Duolingo. But then I go over to Instagram and then I come back and then I do another one and then I go over. That constant back and forth is so much less efficient than just putting the app away totally, being totally engrossed in my social
Yeah.
media. Maybe even learning something from social media because I'm interacting with language learners there. Those can be beneficial conversations to making connections, which then go back to me wanting to learn the languages. And then the next day, I don't say, oh, well, I did this whole lesson yesterday and I don't remember any words. Well, of course I don't, because I wasn't
Right.
focusing on it. And that
Yeah.
sort of radical acceptance of like, it's all right. You don't have to shame yourself for being on Instagram all day, but be honest about it. Like, I'm on there
Yeah.
too much. I'm not doing anything on it. I'm ignoring all these other things. Like when we're honest about it, we can either accept it and go with it, or make choices to change that into what we really want it to be.
Yeah, and I would say for most people, the activities that might not push the needle as much are the most enjoyable typically. Like the apps are very gamified and the graphics and they're very easy to open an app and feel like you're doing something because it's counting up
Hmm.
points and
Yeah.
but I think one we do have to wrap up here in just a few minutes, but one of the final questions I was thinking about is how do you know for sure well, let me define in a different way. Let's take an example of like let's say losing weight or getting healthier. Some part of that experience is going to be unpleasant, uncomfortable, let's say, because nobody will enjoy that all the time or that entire process. You might enjoy bits of it a certain time, but you can't enjoy it all the time. So how do I know the difference between pushing my comfort zone, let's say in language learning as well, let's say doing more tutoring, doing more interactive studying that really helps to find your lacking areas and develop them. And then versus, well, I'm just not that kind of learner. Like it's not part of my
Mm,
personality. Because I'm sure I would make those excuses because it's just uncomfortable, right?
yeah.
Um,
That's a really good question. I don't have an answer to it other than just continually. I mean, it really does come down to honesty. Are you honestly not that kind of person? And if you're not, then what are you willing to do? Are you
right.
willing to eat more salads and less cake? I'm not. I love salads, but I'm not. Um, Honestly assessing, all right, I'm not going to go to the gym even 3 days a week. Am I willing to go for a walk outside in the summer for 30 minutes? Yeah, I could
Hmm.
do that. No, I'm not going to see as fast progress. So same with the languages. Am I going to go to an intensive language class for 6 weeks? No, I'm not going to. What am I comfortable with? I'm comfortable with my once a week lessons, and then they give me something to focus on, and I work on those throughout the week. Um,
Can you learn a language without a little bit of discomfort and pushing your comfort zone?
I don't know yet. I think it's possible. It depends on your tolerance for discomfort. Like
Sure.
I thrive in the unknown and the discomfort. So like I feel really good about that. So maybe so. I don't know. I think with some level of acceptance, um, the painful becomes less painful when we know what
Mm,
to expect and when we actually look forward to it because we know pain means progress. I'm looking forward to
right.
that 30-minute run that I'm not actually doing tomorrow because pain means progress. I'm looking forward to my conversation tomorrow. That's
Yeah.
going to be painful, but I know it means I'm making progress.
And in some ways, that's a guiding light in language learning and other areas because you can assume, of course, there are variables, but generally speaking, if it feels slightly uncomfortable, it's probably the thing you should be doing or do
Mm-hmm.
more of it at least, not exclusively, of course.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
that's like a human reaction, right? When we're being it's like the fear of success we talked about in a
yeah.
previous episode. It's like if it feels like you're pushing the needle, the human response is often to like, oh, I don't like that too much. Let's do something else, like a Duolingo or something that's,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't take any sort of comfort zone, and
Yeah.
you can just get those points and get that dopamine and yeah.
And
So
the ability to sit with that discomfort, even if you're not pushing it and doing the uncomfortable thing, just sitting and saying, this makes me feel uncomfortable, I don't like it, and not choosing to go for the dopamine hit is also
oh yeah, yeah,
a huge advantage because I'm not covering up and avoiding that negative feeling. I'm letting it be, not going to escape to something else. I'm actually just going to sit here and be uncomfortable for a minute. And maybe I do the thing and maybe I don't, but I've learned
yeah.
how to sit with it without escaping it.
Yeah, so really it's impossible to tell. Obviously, there's no rule, but
Yeah,
it
yeah.
seems to me that language learning comes with some degree of discomfort regardless. And that's being honest as well, right? It's not just going to be fun all the time.
It's
There are
not
going to be
easy.
challenging times. It's not easy, definitely not. But there is a difference between that kind of pushing your comfort zone slightly, the discomfort of maybe speaking with a real person and then continuously trying to be something you're not.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, it might be hard in the moment to distinguish, but
It's
I guess people
exhausting in the
you'll
long run.
know, maybe you'll know inside. Like if you
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
think about it, then you'll get there.
It's exhausting in the long run to try acting in a way that's not authentic to you. It really is
Right.
exhausting. You have to constantly do mental gymnastics to work your way through every situation instead of just reacting in a in normal and natural way. So yeah, when you're able to figure that out and do the work to get there, it's just
Yeah.
it feels so much better.
Because you can adapt to your personality and your learning style to some
Hmm.
degree, but at some point you're gonna have to do some hard work, just to get somewhere. You can mitigate that in many cases, but yeah, I do believe that you do have to, like, the hard stuff is usually what gives the the big pushes, the big movements. So
Yep, it's totally worth it. Totally worth it.
right. Oh yeah, and it also feels great afterwards. Like you might be
Yep.
hesitant to, like, oh, I'm nervous to speak with the teacher, but then you speak for like half an hour and you're like, oh, I just did that.
Oh, so many times, as many experiences as I've had being embarrassed because I didn't practice the language all week, and then I know my teacher could tell. I've had double the experiences where I came in and just spoke, and maybe I sucked at it, but I did it and feel really good going out of it. Like those are
Yeah.
worth all that discomfort for sure.
Get addicted to that feeling. That's
Yes.
the right way to do it.
Yes,
But
exactly.
But anyway, Heidi, thank you so much for being on the New Year New Language Summit again. And I just want to remind people that there are two other sessions with you that they can find if they have the golden ticket, the ticket that gives you all the 100+ sessions from the New Year New Language archives. And last year you were talking about the baggage we carried to
Oh
advanced.
yeah, that's
That was
right.
a big bag of interesting, let's say, problems or challenges that people might have. And then the year
Yeah.
before, you were talking about perfectionism, which we've covered quite a lot because we both have some, let's say, traits there that you're, of course, a professed
Yeah.
perfectionist. I'm like 95% as well.
I'm 110.
Yeah. So
No doubt.
so yeah, definitely check that out. And of course, check out Heidi's great podcast, Love, Joy, and Languages, which where she goes into greater detail on all these things that we're talking about here, which we don't have time for, of course, in this format. But otherwise, if you have a question for Heidi or a comment about the session, just leave it below, and I'm sure she'll take the time to get back to you.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Thank you, everyone.